Today I'm going to be taking a look at the newest release from Laurier, at least one of the newest releases. It is their new dress watch called the Zephyr. It's a pretty interesting watch. I think it's something that is kind of missing from the microbrand world. There's not a lot of pure dress watches, so let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of about 31.4, lug to lug of 42, height of only 8.5, and a lug width of 18 millimeters. So some other general specifications for this watch, we're gonna have the Miyota 9039 automatic movement beating away in here. We don't have a seconds hand though, so you can't necessarily tell from the face of the watch that it's running immediately. We also do not have a see-through case back, just a plain case back, which is kind of meant more for engraving and whatnot. We do have 30 meters of stated water resistance with just regular push-pull crown. We do have a hand winding movement here, which has a decent kind of feel to it and decent sound. It's not overly grainy, but it is a little bit grainy. We do have a sapphire crystal here with 7 layers of anti-reflective coating on the underside of the crystal. Does it eliminate reflections? No, not at all. You definitely do get reflections on the watch still, but I'm assuming it does something and helps it with reflections at most angles, so it still does look nice. And last but not least, this watch retails directly from Laurier for $499. So starting off with the dial here, and I think this is one of the main stars of the show for this watch, we have this very beautiful, deep matte red, almost like matte rosy type color to the dial. It's not quite as deep red as the oxblood strap that I'm wearing, but it's also not pink. It's not quite fire shark red. It is this beautiful, kind of almost muted, deepish red color. And what is nice, and I think you can kind of tell here, depending on the angle, it does change in saturation pretty much. You do get different tones of red that come out. You also have this beautiful guilloche pattern that extends out from the middle of the dial in every direction. It has this very nice three-dimensional feel to it. You get not only the depth of the guilloche, but the depth of the patterning of the guilloche as well. It is a very, very well done dial, and it's probably the best part about the watch. Looking a little bit more generally, we have these very beautiful large Delphine style hands, which I think are very well proportioned for the watch itself. It takes up a very good amount of the watch face, and they don't look undersized by any means. You have a minutes hand that goes pretty much right outside to the minutes track, so it does look very harmonious in its design. You do see the markers are done fairly simply. Everything is printed on the dial. We do have basically rectangular style markers everywhere, and then at the 3, 6, 9 we have double markers, and at the 12 we have a triple marker, which is rare to see, but it is nice. It is very nicely balanced. It looks good. The rectangular markers definitely blend in more with the rectangular to no style shape. I think had they been like circular markers or something like that, it would have been at odds with the design language, so I'm glad they went for this design. You could also see you have a beautiful mirroring of the shape of kind of the glass and the case itself with this inner lined portion for the middle center of the dial. Then you have the outer hours track that obviously holds the hours, that also mirrors that shape. And then finally the minutes track. So you do have a lot of the dial elements very harmoniously blending with the case design, with the shapes that are on this watch. Nothing really feels at odds here. And I think just design-wise, it was done really well. You can also see the text was kept very minimal. We just have Laurier in New York here at the 12 and automatic at the 6 o'clock. Nothing else on the dial. It is very simple, very clean, very monochromatic. You just have red and pretty much whitish silver tone for the rest of it. And just like how the dial changes colors at different angles, so does the printing. You can see at some angles, it's almost very silver, very matte, and at others, it's a very almost bright white that is just contrasting very well against the dial. So it has a lot of depth in the watch, even outside of the texture itself. Overall, I think the dial's done very well, very cleanly, very aesthetically pleasing, and let's see how it holds up on macro. So taking a look at the watch in natural sunlight, you can see in the shade it's a very dark, deep cherry red that doesn't have too much of a color depth change to it, but once you get actual light on that dial, you can see it becomes a lot more vibrant, a lot more red. Off angles, you can see the text kind of appears and disappears, becomes more gray, becomes more matte, and then more off angles and straight on, it becomes more bright white, which is a really nice effect. It gives a lot of depth to the dial that otherwise wouldn't be there. And then again, just in the light, there is so much red that comes out of the watch, but depending on the angle, it can go a little bit darker too. So looking at the dial up close, you can see there is very much a three-dimensionality to that guilloche pattern. You can see at certain angles, it doesn't really line up perfectly from kind of like ridge to ridge, quote unquote. So the pattern isn't perfectly aligned, which is obviously something you would get a little bit more closely with a true guilloche cut pattern. But because this is more of a stamping process, you know, you got to get what you pay for. It still is fairly well done. You still, again, get a lot of three-dimensionality to it. If I kind of get it at an angle like that, you can see there is a lot of depth between not only the depth of the actual cutting texture, but between like the ridges of the different sections as well. So it is a pretty cool pattern. It's not high horology, but also it's not a high horology price. Looking at the printing, and I think this is done extremely well. You can see there is a lot of three-dimensionality to the printing itself. And just like I kind of mentioned, it has this silvery, almost plastery type look to it. So there is an actual texture to the printing itself, both for like the Laurier text as well as the just general printing. And it looks pretty good. It stands out literally against the dial itself, both in tone and in height. And it just adds a little bit of extra class to the dial. There are gentle curves along it. There are just beautiful textures and tones and shapes. So there is a lot to look at here and a lot that's actually really well done. There really aren't any QC issues that I see with the printing or really with the guilloche pattern itself. So moving on to the hands, obviously that story does change. Although you have this beautiful Dauphine style bifaceted handset, it is not finished overly well. The only applied metal element on the watch and is also the worst finished part of the watch. You do have a lot of speckling, kind of dust marks, just general QC things that should have maybe been paid a little bit more attention to. But I'm not overly mad because again, this is a $500 watch. And from wrist view, these aren't issues that I ever see. You know, as the light catches it and the light kind of covers up these more minor blemishes, you don't ever notice that the hands are, you know, quote unquote, poorly QC'd. There are just a little bit of specks and dust along the handset, but it's not that terrible. Would I like to see it tightened up a little bit? Yes, but as it stands, it's not that bad. So moving on to the case of this watch, and while I think it is generally as interesting as the dial relatively, it's also, I think, the thing that lets the watch down a little bit. So looking at the case shape itself, we have all high polishing everywhere. There aren't any brush surfaces on the case back other than the very back where we have this kind of like laser etch thing, which I guess isn't technically brushed, but you know what I mean. It has this very unique shape, this very nice tonneau that is the thinnest here at the lugs, kind of widens towards the mid case and thins back out. It has this nice, beautiful stepping to it, this very gentle curve along the edge. It is kind of bowed out as well, where it's thickest in the mid case here. From this angle, you can kind of see you have a almost two-piece construction, this mid case, which is, you know, almost kind of bisected right here and makes it almost pure thinner than it is. And then you have the actual bezel portion on top, which is a more defined square that has a gentle curve to it. I think the main area where the watch starts showing its price point is in the fact that these kind of elements don't blend together perfectly at the edge between here, the case and the bezel. There is a little bit of a step down, which stylistically looks really cool and it has a very architectural type feel. But at least in my model, because there is that like gentle gap there, there is some dust and stuff that accumulates in there that I can't seem to perfectly clean out. So it is one of those things where the tolerances maybe aren't as high as you would expect from a watch, you know, a couple multiples of the price. But at the end of the day, again, this is only a $500 watch. And I think for what you're paying for, it is still very serviceable. It's still very unique. It's a case shape you're obviously not going to see in many applications. And it's not that badly done. It just is kind of a product of its price. Outside that kind of dust trapping issue, there isn't anything overtly bad about the case either. I would say maybe the kind of edges here, the quote unquote lugs, even though it is blending into the case, feels a little bit thin compared to the rest of the watch. But that's not a bad thing either. It just is a design choice. Looking at the general side profile, you can see the watch isn't very thick at all. It has not really a curve to the mid case, but because it's so thin, it does wear very well on the wrist itself. And it's not very long lug to lug either, so it is just a very nice wearing watch. It's very similar to about a 34, 35 millimeter on wrist, so it doesn't have a large presence by any means. Of course, we do have the signed Laurier crown there, that same logo here on the case back, again, mainly made for engraving. This is the standard strap that comes with the watch, branded. Just a classic genuine leather strap. It's not as badly made as like a genuine leather strap you'd expect from like some Seiko of the same price, but at the end of the day, it's not the most amazing strap in the world. And I would mention the fact that this comes with a black and brown strap, but I can't for the life of me get the brown strap to fit onto this watch. There's something about like the lug ends of the brown strap, maybe I think just being too thick, and it just will not fit. So if you have a really, really thick strap, because it is a fairly short lug, the clearance might be too small. But outside of that other stock brown Laurier strap, I haven't really had many other issues fitting other 18 millimeters on there. So, you know, your mileage may vary. I think the watch has a very nice architectural shape to it. Of course, you have this very nice, almost like stepping from the case all the way from the bottom up to the top to the flat crystal. And it is just a very nicely architecture case with a lot of curves, with a lot of geometry. And it's something that I think you don't really see a lot at this price point. A lot of people kind of just go for simple circles, simpler shapes, because it's just easier to do. Kind of Baltic comes to mind. They're not very overtly interesting cases, and they're made to almost be quote unquote mass produced. It's nothing overly special, it just is. Where this goes a little bit in the other direction, try something just different and new. So moving on to how the watch wears, earlier I was wearing my 34mm Tudor here because I think these do have a very similar presence on wrist despite being different shapes. So let's try that on. And one last look at the Tudor. And then here we have the technically 31 and change millimeter Laurier on my 6.5-inch wrist. I think it's a very, very perfectly proportioned. I have a Cartier tank, which appears much smaller than this watch on wrist, and that's the Cartier tank medium in quartz. So it's one of those watches where I think in terms of a, dressier leaning watch and a untraditional watch shape, more of a tonneau type square, rectangle-ish more, this does wear, I think, pretty well for its size. And it's definitely not oversized, which I think is a problem that a lot of untraditionally shaped watches tend to go. You get like 39mm squares, which just wear huge, whereas this is much more traditionally sized. This, I would say, just from memory, wears very similar to like a Grand Tie Reverso. So maybe that's something to keep in mind. Looking at the watch, again, lugs do not overhang on my wrist. It doesn't rise overly high up off the wrist, would obviously easily fit under a dress cuff. I think it looks pretty good. The way the guilloche tends to play with the light is just very nice. Again, I think the dial and the printing and the way the printing goes from like a silver to pure white, the dial goes from a red to a different shade of red, and the guilloche kind of pops in and out. It's just a very, very beautiful effect. It is a very well done dial, and overall one that I think maybe looks more expensive than the price point would suggest. And there we have it from the side view. As you can see, sits very, very well into the wrist, doesn't rise up very high at all. Just very comfortable, no sharp edges. There's a lot of curves on this watch, so it's really not digging in any way. The crown is very small too, so that doesn't dig into the wrist. It's not oversized, so it doesn't dig into the wrist on the bottom either. This is the stock, I believe it's the smaller version. I believe that they have a standard and a smaller version of the standard straps. And I am, I think, the third hole from the bottom. Yep, so I'm about like kind of midway in the strap with my 6.5-inch wrist. So you can go maybe up to 6.75 or so inch wrist with the small strap, and then you'd probably want to go on to the other regular standard size one. But this one is a very comfortable fit, fits nicely, goes down a little bit smaller as well. So it's a very, very comfortable on wrist. Again, I think this is a watch where the dial almost outshines the rest of the watch, and that's almost why maybe it also makes the case feel a little bit cheaper, just because the dial is so well done. I think it almost deserves a more complicated, robust case. So moving on to some other straps here, we have this nice suede strap from Cheapest NATO Straps, or they might be named something else right now, so I'll have whatever it is linked down below. I think this nice sandy golden tone works really well with the red, makes it a little bit more casual, it just looks fantastic, and yeah, I think at least color-wise it pairs pretty well. You can get into an issue where you have straps with like kind of thicker ends, where it kind of bulges up visually and just maybe doesn't look great, because again, you have a lot of thinner elements around the lugs here, so the thicker strap kind of combats that and looks a little bit weird sometimes. But overall, not too bad of a combo. One thing I will note is, although the movement itself isn't loud in the ticking sense, the rotor is loud at times. It's not the loudest, it's not something I overly notice day to day, but it is definitely on the louder side. Depending on what angle you hit it, you can definitely get that kind of classic Miyota wobble rotor winding sound. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you know that's already going to bother you, keep that in mind. Next, we have a little bit more of a classic light brown Buttero leather. This looks, I think, fantastic on the watch. It's not as thick at the ends as the other strap was, so I think it pairs a little bit better. This one is technically made by King Leathercraft, but I don't believe they make straps at the moment, so you can get a similar one from Delugs. They also use natural Buttero leather for some straps. So yeah, pretty decent combo. If I move the watch a little bit up higher, this is closer to a 6-inch wrist here, and still very much can have clearance on both sides, still looks very, very proportional. So this is a watch that can easily be worn on a wide variety of wrists. It's just something you have to know whether or not you like smaller looking watches. Again, it wears very similar to a Grand Tie Reverso, that medium-sized Reverso look. So if you already know that's not for you, this watch won't be for you. Next, we have this nice pink silicone strap from, I believe, HNS Straps. I don't know if they make straps anymore, but they used to sell on Amazon. Either way, pink silicone looks pretty cool, pairs with the red tones, and why not add some fun? Very comfortable combo, very nice looking, obviously plays into those red tones and just livens it up a little bit. I really like it. And lastly, we have the classic white Archer silicone strap. Looks pretty great, I think. Pops really nicely, pairs well with the kind of silver white printing. And yeah, it's just a really good combo. Nothing bad to say, looks pretty great. A little bit of a bright combo, so maybe if you want to tone it down, go for gray or go for maybe a dark red too, which will look cool. But yeah, that is the Archer Silicone. So pros and cons of this watch, and I think one of the biggest pros for the watch is just the size. It's nice to see a smaller watch that actually fits kind of relatively small. This fits very similar to like a 34, 35-ish millimeter watch, and there's not a lot of companies making watches at that size anymore, or even more like purified dress watches that are meant to be smaller. The main ones that come to mind are, you know, like I guess now you have the Oris Rectangular, you have the Longines, whatever they call it, I believe it's the Dolce Vita, and then you have maybe the Reverso and the Cartier Tank. So there's not a lot of options in between that, and there's not a lot of options at the affordable range. So it's really nice to see Laurier stepping in there. Another big pro for the watch, in my opinion, is the dial itself. I think the dial is pretty well done, especially considering the price point. The guilloche pattern, of course, it's not crazy rose engine turned, but it looks pretty good, especially just from wrist view for the price point. The color depth is really nice, and the printing in specific, I think, is done very well on the watch. You have this silvery type whitish printing that kind of fades and disappears and then gets very bright at certain angles. So it's a very lively printing that I think really adds some depth and dimensionality to the dial design. You end up having the three-dimensionality of the printing that really bounces and plays with the three-dimensionality of the actual guilloche texture. And it's a really, really fun dial. Following on from that, I think the colors that they picked for the dials are just fantastic. You obviously have a very classic white with blue hands, black dial, and then there's a very, very gorgeous, I think a little bit more modern red dial. It's not as strictly or purely dressy as the other dials feel. It is a little bit more playful. It also just is a very, very nice shade of red. It's not too bright, it's not too matte, it's not too reflective. They just went for a very, very nice tone that's actually very versatile, I think. Lastly, I think the price is just fair for the watch overall. You're getting a pretty unique case shape, a pretty unique dial, decent movement, decent dimensions, decent wearability, all for about $500. So for what you're paying and what you're getting, I think the value is there. Moving on to cons, and although the case is very interesting and well done, for me it is somewhat of a con for the watch because it is, I guess you could say, the weakest link of the watch itself. The dial looks fairly well done, and when it is combined with the case by comparison ends up cheapening the watch in my opinion. It's not as refined, it's not as dynamic, it's not as interesting as well. It does have an interesting shape, it has a decent amount of architecture to it, but the way it integrates the kind of a little bit more simplistic in its form, where you can make it a little bit more complicated, a little bit more three-dimensional as well, a little bit more stepping, things like that. There definitely are some things they can do to maybe beef up the case as well. So the case isn't bad as it stands, but I think it is a weak point on the watch overall. With that being said, this is the first time they've ever done this case shape. This is the first time they've done this dress watch series, and kind of speaking from experience, having seen multiple generations of the Laurier Falcon or the Laurier Neptune, it usually gets better with, you know, as the series goes on. It's a fantastic first step for the series, and keeping all that in mind and the fact that they probably will iterate and make it better, I think this will be a very, very interesting and awesome line in the future. The only other real con I have with the watch is I think the rotor is a little bit on the loud side. It is the classic Miyota. It does have a little bit of that classic like helicoptering that goes on at certain angles. I didn't hear it too often when I wore it, but I did hear it every once in a while, and it's always a little bit weird to see. It takes you out of the wearing experience a little bit. It's nothing too crazy, it's nothing too unexpected, and I think for the price point it's justified. So final thoughts on the watch, and I do really like it. It's a watch that I thought looked pretty interesting from the press photos, and in person I think also came together and wore pretty well, looked pretty nice, and design-wise I think kind of nailed it. In terms of harmony with the dial and the case shape and just the way the watch comes together in person and on wrist, it is very, very, very well executed. The dial in specific, I think, is almost perfectly done. From the guilloche pattern to the way the hands complement the dial to the indices to all the shapes that appear on the dial. It just is a very, very clean, classic, and it has just enough interest and design to it without being cluttered or too much or too art deco or too just anything. It just has just enough spice to it. Is this the best, most fantastic dress watch ever made? No, but I think for what you're paying for, that $500 price point, it's a really interesting, compelling option, especially since like a lot of people maybe won't wear dress watches all the time, or maybe this is your gateway into trying to wear a dress watch more casually, but you don't want to spring for a super expensive watch to start with. This is a really fun way to kind of dip your toes and see if you like dressier leaning watches, see if you like more untraditional case shapes, because again, this is not a circle, it's not a square, it is very much like a tonneau style, and there's not many of those out there, and it's always nice to see one because it gives you a very, very different wearing experience when you wear the watch. I think if you're already interested in this watch, you're gonna like it in person. There's not much in person that lets me down with it. Again, for me, the K-shape is something that I think can be improved upon, but as it stands, it's not bad. It's not something that makes me dislike the watch. It's just something that I think can be improved upon because the rest of the design language and the kind of bare bones of the watch itself, I can see it being so much better. I did enjoy my time with the watch. I think it is a fantastic addition to the Laurier lineup. At the end of the day, I think more dress watches need to be kind of in the watch world, especially at the more affordable price point, because there's not a lot out there. The Baltic MR, I believe it's MR01, came out fairly recently, and it's kind of taken the watch nerdom by storm because it's something that really hasn't been offered, and it is done fairly well. And I think this Zephyr can be part of that kind of area. It can be a series that ends up being this little watch nerd niche that is just flourishing and is gorgeous and people appreciate. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.